Hey everyone, it's Tim here for another update, and I hope you're doing well, rejoicing in the grace of God in Christ. And I want to continue with you with another installation from our book we're moving through here, Christ Set Forth by Thomas Goodwin, regarding Jesus as the object of justifying faith. And to remind you, his key verse is Romans 8:34, which lays out this sequence. So Christ, he says, who will condemn? Christ is the one who died. More than that, who is raised, who is at the right hand of God, who is interceding for us. So Goodwin is moving through all these things. First of all, Christ himself is the object of faith that justifies. Then Christ who died, Christ in his death. And then this section of the book, he's dealing with Christ who was raised as the object of justifying faith. And you and I might have kind of a blind spot or not think that much regarding the doctrine of justification. What's the point of it? How does it contribute to our salvation? We can look at the cross and say, okay, Jesus is taking on the wrath of God. He's paying our debt of sin. But once he dies, we might not really understand, well, why have a resurrection? Is it just kind of to finish the story? But there's a lot of theological importance to the resurrection. And even the next two sections regarding his ascension and his intercession, well, those couldn't happen without a resurrection. But even the resurrection itself has great theological importance, including in this area of our justification, or how we're declared right before God. So, first of all, Goodwin points out, by way of kind of outline, that both the resurrection of Christ is a means of proving our justification, demonstrating our justification, but also it's a means of effecting our justification. So it not only shows that we're justified, but it's part of how God does justify us in Christ. And a key verse on the resurrection as a means for our justification is in Romans 4:25, that Christ was crucified for our transgressions and raised for our justification. And you may have puzzled over that verse. How is it that his resurrection contributes to our justification? Well, this is kind of what this section is about. And regarding this issue of proof, Goodwin looks at two capacities that Christ is in relative to us. One of them is Christ as a surety, and the other is Christ as a common person. So let's first talk about Christ as a surety. What this means, this is an archaic term, of course, he's writing in the 1600s. A surety is somebody who does something for another, like take on the burden of their debt. They enter the situation and make themselves a pledge for the debt of another. So they're saying, I will promise that I will take care of this debt for them. And if I don't, then I can be penalized like them. So that's kind of what a surety is. Another word we have in Hebrews 7:22, there's this term surety used. Christ is the surety of a better covenant in the older translation that Goodwin's using. In our ESV, that's translated as a guarantor. So someone who stands to guarantee that this debt will be paid off or the covenant will be discharged. So that's a role that Christ has for us. Well, how do we know that our surety, who has come alongside us and become a pledge and said, I will pay the debt for them, I'll do it for them, how do we know he's effectively discharged the sin debt for us in his death on the cross? Well, here's what Goodwin says, quote, the resurrection does plainly evidence it, that you shall never be condemned for it. For by the law, if the surety has discharged the debt, the debtor is then free, end quote. So the resurrection proves the surety who took on himself to become a pledge for our debt has his payment of that debt has been accepted, and he is no longer bound to that to guarantee that debt. The other capacity that Christ stands in, and again, this is another way that he proves that we have been justified in his resurrection, is as a common person. And a common person is one who does something as though they were somebody else. They're doing it in their place, and so they're doing it is as though the other person had done it. It's a representation. So a classic biblical example of this, and parallel in many ways with Christ, is Adam. Adam was a common person. He sinned as a common person. His sin didn't just affect himself, of course, but it made all the subsequent human race sinners. It put us all under the debt of sin. It put us all under the unrighteous status before God, and it made us all subject to the penalty for sin of death. And Christ is called the second Adam in places like Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. There's this parallel drawn between Adam, the one who sinned for us all, and Christ, the one who is righteous for us all, there in Romans 5, or who was resurrected for us all in 1 Corinthians 15. And Christ was a common person in all that he did on earth. He was living, he was being righteous, he was keeping the law, he was dying, and he was being raised, all as a representative to bring others along with him by union with him. So this is what Goodwin says. Thus, when Christ died, he died as a common person, and God reckoned that we died also. When Christ arose, he rose as our head and as a common person. And so then God accounts that we rose also with him, end quote. And this helps make sense of texts. Like you may have read Romans 6, 10, and 11 and kind of wondered, what are you thinking, Paul? How are you getting here when he says that because Christ died and rose, we ought to reckon ourselves to be dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus? And you might scratch your head and go, how is it that because Christ died and rose, then therefore in Christ somehow we think of ourselves, consider ourselves as having died and been raised? Well, it's because he did it as a representative for us. He did it as a common person. And so we can consider ourselves, we ought to consider ourselves alive, no longer under sin, no longer under the curse and death, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. And there in Romans 6, the application is therefore present your bodies as instruments of righteousness. You're no longer slaves to sin. So that's how the resurrection shows that we're justified. Well, how is it that the resurrection actually contributes to our justification, actually helps effect it? And then here's where Goodwin talks again about Christ being a common person. And what did Christ do as a common person is he became sin for us, using the language of 2 Corinthians 5:21. He took on himself our sin, and he stood in the place of sinners. And so he became a representative sin bearer for us. And then we might ask, okay, so he took sin on himself for us. He became sin in our place. When was that sin gone? When was he no longer being sin for us? When was the debt or the guilt discharged and gone from him? Well, it's at the moment of his resurrection. You see, we might think of it as his death, but his death wasn't even really the end of his humiliation, because what did he do? He went to the dead. He went to the grave, the place of the dead. You see Psalms talking about this. And he was in the place of the dead, in the lowest place. Texts will speak of him being in the depths of the earth, things like that. He was in that place of the dead, or Sheol, and it was at the resurrection that he comes up. That's when he stops going downward and he starts coming upward toward glory. The resurrection is when that switch flips. And he's no longer sin for us, but he's now resurrected, and he's now being exalted for us. So this is something we might not think about with Jesus a lot, but it's actually his resurrection that was his moment of justification, because it's Jesus' resurrection that's his moment of vindication, the declaration that yes, indeed, he is righteous. Even though he just suffered the penalty for sinners as though he were sin, he in fact is righteous. And we think about our justification as our being declared righteous in Christ because we're in union with Christ. But Christ's justification is God declaring, yes, you are righteous. You are in fact righteous. And it's us kind of riding his coattails, him as a common person. That's why we get to be counted righteous. He's looked at Isaiah 50 verse 8 before. This is one of the servant songs, and it's a prophecy of Christ. It's Isaiah speaking as the servant, as Christ. And listen to Isaiah 50 verse 8. In fact, this is the verse that Paul is quoting and drawing from there in Romans 8 when he says, who will condemn me? But listen to what the servant says there in that same verse. He who vindicates me is near. He's suffering. He's being persecuted by men. And in the midst of that, he looks beyond his suffering, looks beyond the humiliation of the cross. And he says, God who vindicates me is near. Therefore, I will not be condemned. And so for Paul to quote this messianic psalm of Christ looking at his vindication or his justification that comes with his being raised, and to say, Christian, this is yours as well. This is where it feeds our faith. And Goodwin said early on, I'm going through all these things, not just to teach you doctrine, but so that your faith might find victory in all these things, that you can have assurance. And that's what Christ's resurrection is supposed to be for us, that we can look at this concrete event in history in which we, and even how it's personalized to us in our baptism. That's part of what baptism is meant to image, is that we went down into the grave with Christ and we came up again to new life with Christ. He doing those for us as a common person. And so we can have assurance. We ought to have personalized assurance in that historical event of what Christ did, that it's ours. that by faith we have died, we have been raised, and we are justified, and no one can condemn us, certainly not God himself. So I hope that's an encouragement to your faith, just as it is to mine. Transitioning to some announcements for us. We have this Saturday a Christmas potluck, special time of getting together, and there will be a message on Christmas, a gospel message. So this would be a great time to invite friends as well. There's info in the newsletter on that. Also Sunday, we have Equipping Hour at 9 o'clock. We're continuing our series on contentment. We have corporate worship at 10:30, and then we're going to be having community groups at 5 p.m. in various homes. So again, check out the newsletter for info on where the community groups will be. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you Sunday.